Happy New Year, everyone. I have a most exciting gift to share with you. A deep dive into the security guarantees that Ukraine needs. You see, while most folks in the West were catching up with their families, there was this thing called a war kind of happening over in eastern Ukraine. And as our collective holiday high fades away, there are a couple of important diplomatic developments that we need to cover. One is the agreement between the United States and Ukraine on what a 20-point peace plan should look like. I discussed the important details of it on a Christmas Eve special edition of Lines on Maps. Check that out perhaps after we are done today. Regardless, what you need to know for the purposes of this video is the top line of point 14, which says, in Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson Oblasts, the line of military positions on the date of signing will be recognized as the de facto front line. In other words, the United States is, at least as of this minute, on board with the territorial division that Europe has floated for almost a year now. If it feels like we have been running faster and faster, only to ultimately go nowhere, well, that is because we are running faster and faster, only to ultimately go nowhere. The second major development was a Mar-a-Lago meeting between Trump and Zelensky over the weekend. This one had more of the flavor of their meeting chaperoned by European leaders, or their unmemorable bilateral encounter at the United Nations, than the chaos of the February 28th Oval Office meltdown. It seems that the main topic of discussion was security guarantees, and what role the United States would play in such a post-war institution. And what is strange about this is that there is an agreement between the two that the United States will be part of the security guarantee, despite having mostly sat on the sidelines since Trump returned to office. So what I want to do today is examine what exactly is a reasonable expectation for Ukraine here, given that the country needs something, and you cannot magically conjure a credible US commitment out of thin air. But let's start by discussing Ukraine's needs before trying to understand the US constraints. And that takes us back to point 14 of the peace plan. Put bluntly, it does not match the military balance between the two sides. And you all know by now that any feasible settlement must roughly match what the parties would expect to happen if the war continued to a military conclusion. The bright spot here for Ukraine is that this plan does not create the same domino problem as the Russian plan that a Kremlin affiliate leaked earlier in the month. Namely, that if Ukraine cedes territory that contains defensive fortifications, Russia could immediately restart the war and expect to capture even more. The intriguing part is that what I just described is not exactly a mystery. The US negotiators are aware that the proposal freezes the front lines, but that the Kremlin prefers to keep marching given its current rate of gains. Thus, presumably, the United States is aware on some level of the need to artificially boost Ukraine's coercive power to close the gap. Now, the discussion of how to do that really picked up following Zelensky's release of the 20-point peace plan. And the coverage of it has continued in the days since, with the conversation turning to what the guarantee would look like and how long it would last. But the whole plan had been floating around in the news much earlier in December, just with fewer news sources and an uneven distribution of those sources. That is where the sponsor of today's video, Ground News, comes up huge. Their blind spot feed will help you discover stories your standard outlets might not have shown you, like Ukraine intercepting Russian orders to execute prisoners of war, or Moscow refusing to provide any evidence that a drone did indeed strike one of Putin's residences. I suspect that one is going to stay relevant for a while. But by going to ground.news/linesonmaps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take a fantastic 40% off Advantage plan, which will give you all of the tools that you need to stay on top of everything. So thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. We should return to those security guarantees, though. At the most basic level, a patron security guarantee gives a protege state a power boost in the event that a war restarts. So, Russia and Ukraine agree to a ceasefire along a line that is not commensurate with the balance of power between them. But Russia does not break the agreement because some entity will artificially strengthen Ukraine, precisely because Russia broke the agreement. And here is where we need to have some real talk. For all of 2025, Ukraine tried to loop the United States into offering a security guarantee. Well, with the year coming to a close, the best grade that I can offer is an incomplete. Now, I am certain that you have seen many keyboard warriors opine that Ukraine is wasting its time here. The Trump administration does not care about Europe and desperately wants to reduce US commitments on the continent. Where Zelensky should instead be focusing his time is on recruiting Europe to agree to a deeper role, as the leaders there care more about the war's outcome. Okay, if you encounter such a person with such a strong opinion, I suggest pointing out the following. Zelensky knows your argument already. He has heard it 1,000 times. He is not naive to the politics going on around him. For goodness sake, he sat through this dreadfully painful conversation about card playing. Card playing! And yet, the keyboard warriors think that they should lecture Zelensky on Trumpian politics. Right. I am likely preaching to the choir here, but as a first principles approach, it is usually better to not start by thinking that keyboard warriors have a better understanding of the situation than world leaders. Instead, a better way to think about the situation is that it is a puzzle. Why does Zelensky continue to pursue Trump despite this previous interaction with him? Unfortunately for those keyboard warriors, the answer here continues to undermine their suggestion. Ukraine needs the United States because a European security commitment is just not good enough on its own. That is probably not happy news to those keyboard warriors, which might explain why they are reluctant to confront this reality. But war does not care about your hopes and dreams. It cares about what can actually be done. Irony of ironies, Trump would love it if Europe were capable of doing this alone. But that is not the world that we live in after Europe neglected its defense budgets for decades, despite equally many decades of prodding from the United States. Thus, it seems that we have reached a bit of an impasse. Ukraine cannot reach an agreement commensurate with the expected military outcome, because that would immediately shift the expected military outcome further west. But Russia will not agree to freeze the front lines where they are without sufficient external threats. The United States is a necessary player in those external threats, but Europe is the Trump administration's third priority after the Americas and the Indo-Pacific. Consequently, there is no settlement on the horizon. I will try to break that impasse in a minute, but while we are here, we might as well knock out some forms of security guarantees that will not work. For one, the United States cannot simply say that it will act as a guarantor and solve all of these problems, because Russia will not believe that threat, and actions are the currency of value in international relations, not words. Again, probably something that the keyboard warriors would be better off not lecturing Ukraine about. Russia promised to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity under the Budapest Memorandum, and we all know how that ended. Note here that the United States did not pledge to help Ukraine fight Russia should Russia break its end of the memorandum, contrary to the ahistorical online commentary that often arises on the subject. But the whole experience has certainly taught Ukraine the need for something more tangible this time around. That often segues the conversation to tripwire forces, foreign troops deployed along the front line, who will die in the event of a Russian restart. That, in theory, would inflame public opinion back in the home country and result in a much larger military response. Russia internalizing what will happen if it does restart the war, then opts not to. Of course, Europe is not about to make such a deployment while a war is ongoing, never mind the United States doing that. And the Kremlin is so against the idea in general that Russian troops would keep the fight going just to stop that from happening, if there ever were the expectation that a pause would lead to such deployments. The one straightforward option left would be what you might call a manufactured commitment. It is true that words on the world stage mean little, but domestic words may mean a whole lot. If you make something a domestic law, then there is a whole domestic legal system geared toward enforcing it, at least in some countries. Even if politicians do not exactly want to follow through, there will be some special interests in the country who do, and they can sue the government until the government follows through on the law. It is one of the brilliant creations of democracy. You can manufacture commitments out of thin air, subject to the constraints of how difficult it is to pass a new law to overturn the old one. And in the United States, it is indeed hard. A majority vote in one chamber of Congress, a supermajority vote in the second, plus a president's signature. And you can see how Ukraine is headed down this pathway after the most recent set of talks with US diplomats. The talk is that a ceasefire agreement would be an act of Congress, enshrined in domestic law, and making the security guarantee something that an interested party could sue over if the United States does not follow through. That is a step in the right direction, but it is unclear whether it will be enough. The value of a manufactured commitment is on a sliding scale based on the strength of domestic institutions. Take an autocracy like Russia, and it is nearly meaningless. If Putin does not want to do it, he can snap his fingers and change the law. This is why no one is banking that a pure Russian promise will permanently end the war. Well, the United States is backsliding. How many times have you seen Trump do something over the last year? Someone points out that a law prevents Trump from doing that, and then nothing happens, at least for the short run. Yep, that is the downside of rising authoritarianism. Even when it might be helpful to commit to something, you cannot. Now, this has always been a problem inside of the United States to some degree. Usually, Congress delegates the president as the one who decides whether to verify that a foreign country has broken an agreement. The executive, therefore, naturally has a lot of leeway here. On the flip side, the United States remains on the democratic half of the autocracy scale. It is not neighbors with Russia. When Trump does something in violation of existing law, eventually someone sues. Eventually someone sues, despite my autocorrect's insistence that someone dies instead. And eventually some court overturns the policy as a result of the lawsuit. But that can take forever. Just think about how long we have had the Trump tariffs, with the administration using a legal argument that the Supreme Court found dubious. I suspect that Ukraine will not be reassured that after Russia invades it again, someone will eventually sue, and some court will eventually rectify the problem. But yeah, autocorrect had it right this time. Someone will die in the meantime. Actually, a lot of people will die in the meantime. Ukraine needs more than just a congressionally approved treaty here for this to work. And we can find a hint at one possible solution along that sliding scale of autocracy. The European Union has robust institutions, both at the Brussels level and also within a large number of its member states. Manufactured commitments are possible here, and you could exploit that to loop the United States into the commitment. Look, Donald Trump is nothing if not transactional. Dangle enough money in front of him, and you can rest assured that he will do what you want him to do. Not because he cares about you, but because he cares about the money that you are offering. Imagine that the European Union passed contingent military aid to Ukraine. We are talking about hundreds of billions of euros, but only paid out following a Russian violation of the agreement. Europe does not have enough military manufacturers to spend all of that money. Some, well, a lot of the money will have to go to purchase weapons from the United States. That means dollar signs for Trump, and that is how you get Trump to follow you. Of course, Europe need not simply give away that money. When you are spending at that level, you can put conditions on the money that the United States must follow. I will defer to Europe exactly what the continent would like to extract from the United States, but you could imagine it might be something along the lines of placing military advisors in Kyiv, or an active role in constructing new frontline fortifications post-settlement. And we know already that this will induce US compliance. In fact, NATO already does this with the Pearl Initiative, which is how Ukraine continues to receive US equipment that Europe is incapable of producing. The best part of the strategy is that if it works, Europe never ends up spending any of that money. Russia sees the consequences of breaking a ceasefire and realizes that it is worse than the alternative. Therefore, it complies. And if Russia does break it, well, remember that NATO countries have committed to spending 3.5% of GDP on defense anyway. Ukraine aid explicitly counts toward that. Meanwhile, for however long Russia does comply, Europe can continue working on its defense industrial base, thereby reducing its dependency on the United States over time. Is that the ideal security guarantee for Ukraine? Probably not, but it has a chance at working, and that is better than the hopes and dreams that some plans stand on, as well as the naivete that other plans stand on. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take a fantastic 40% off Advantage plan. Also, don't forget that I have a shorter video on the key contents of the US-Ukraine plan. But for now, if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.